G'day guys, and today I want to make another video on environmentalism. Now, I've got a problem with modern environmentalists. You see, they're very concerned about the environment. They think it's sort of, the great battle of our time. It's one of these things that if we don't do something about it, we're all going to die, or at least horrible things will happen and millions of people will suffer and the earth will be irreparably damaged and this sort of thing. So obviously they're very concerned about this. And you'd think they'd be willing to, debate everything and discuss all ideas. We need to figure this out, so we need to make sure we explore all avenues of success. Nothing must be held back. This is the planet we're talking about, our children's future. Panic stations, chocks away. We need to do something. But the problem is they're nothing like this at all. They're very disingenuous, I found. There's two topics in particular that they will never discuss, and any sort of discussion on climate change, environmentalism, protecting the planet, sustainability and that sort of thing just completely omits these two topics. And these are migration and debt. Now, migration and debt are important to me beyond the sort of environmental impact that they have. Of course, being a libertarian, I want to restrict immigration from the third world, and I also want to restrict government debt. But it's important that we begin to bring up these two topics now, because not only is Australia under threat from mass migration and increasing government debt, but we're also going to be under threat from the totalitarian of climate change per se, because as I mentioned in my previous video, the Labour Party running on a platform of very concerned, very strong on climate change, not getting in, that's going to get people all anxious and riled up, and they're going to begin to harangue a bit more. So I'll do what no environmentalist appears willing to do, especially down here in Australia in the form of the Labour Party and the Greens Party, and I'll begin to discuss migration and debt. So starting with the former. Okay, so what we need to think about is that migration from the third world to the first world moves people from a low carbon footprint lifestyle to a lifestyle with a higher carbon footprint. So to take a look at this, we have a look in the difference in living standards and material possessions between the first world and the third world. And what do we see? Well, it's pretty obvious. But most importantly, most people in the first world have several labour-saving devices that massively increase our carbon footprint. So I'm talking about washing machines, fridges, cars, boats, public transport, air conditioning, all of that stuff, all the trappings of a sterilised modern environment. Now all this stuff, all these labour-saving devices, they all need energy. And that energy is obviously generated from somewhere, be it coal, gas, fossil fuels, solar, wind. And each one of those energy generating methods comes with a carbon price tag. Even clean coal per se and solar and wind still come with a carbon price tag, because obviously when you're going to construct your solar farm or construct your wind farm, you're bringing in vehicles and you're moving them around the country and moving materials, and that'll require some kind of electricity in its own. So of course, when you're bringing the massive solar panels out to the desert, you've got to transport them in the truck, and that truck runs on petrol. And also the maintenance of the electricity grid requires petrol, and getting people out to your job requires petrol. But we understand this. So clean methods of generating energy still have a carbon price tag, is what I'm getting at. So by bringing people from the third world to the first world, we allow them easy access to a lifestyle that consumes vastly more resources than they would back home. Developed, industrialised nations like Australia are the ones consuming the most resources per capita, so we shouldn't be adding more people into the mix and further burdening Mother Nature. I believe Australia is one of the worst nations per capita or per household for use of water and electricity, because obviously we're running a lot of aircon because it's bloody hot here in most of the country. Now, I'm a big fan of analogies. I think it's very important or very useful to be able to render complex ideas in a simplified, easily digestible manner for people to consume. This obviously helps with the spread of ideas. So I'm going to attempt to analogize this issue as I see it to you. So consider a room full of people. On one side of the room is a smoking area where several people are, puffing away and blowing out their carcinogenic smoke out into the rest of the room. Now obviously, we don't want the whole room to fill up with cancer-causing smoke, as eventually the room will become uninhabitable. We understand this. This is our problem, our issue, as a sort of self-contained micro-society of one room. We've got to do something about the smoke problem. Why then would we invite more people into our smoking corner of the room and encourage them and allow them to smoke? That directly exacerbates the dilemma they're in. If those people stayed in their corner of the room, they wouldn't be able to get access to as many cigarettes, and they wouldn't be able to, release so much smoke. But if we bring them into the smoking area and, hand out cigarettes and encourage them to smoke and say, look, this is the way we do things here, just join in, well, obviously they're going to be producing much more smoke over here than they would be over there. And, that's just filling up the room with more smoke, which makes it, as I said, uninhabitable. It's very strange to me why environmentalists tend to have pro-migration views. One of the things they like to talk about is how emissions from the first world are causing, climate change disasters in the third world and encouraging migration. Well, I don't think it would help at all to bring people who are displaced by climate change into the first world and, encourage them to use more resources, get a higher carbon footprint, because this in turn would, again, cause more climate change. Again, not going into whether climate change is real or not, but assuming that is true, this is what these people believe, we're taking on their ideas and running with it. We take people from the third world, we move them to the first world, and they generate a lot more carbon emissions. How is this good for the planet at all? And again, this is something that is never discussed. The other issue that you will never hear discussed is debt, specifically government debt. Now, debt is the consumption of future resources in the present. Say you go into debt to buy a pair of shoes worth $100. You put it on your credit card or you take out a loan or something. You have just spent some of the future hours you'll be working in the present, right now. So if I got a credit card, if I owned one, shouldn't own a credit card by the way, if I got my credit card, hypothetically, and bought a $100 pair of shoes, I've just spent approximately 6.5 hours that I will be working in the future, right now. Now obviously this isn't very long-sighted, and without strict oversight becomes detrimental to your long-term survival. There's going into debt and there's going into debt. Getting $10 to lended to you from a friend is not the same as, racking up huge amounts of debt on your credit card. So obviously there needs to be some judgment on your part, and it's very important that you, again, have this strict oversight. But obviously this isn't great for our long-term survival if we're very, flippant with it. Think about ancestral humans up in the frozen tundra, and if they, gorge themselves on their winter food stores, you spend, a long time, all of spring, all of summer, building up these food stores, you've got so much food, and if you just eat it all in one big frenzy, you'll feel really great in the moment, but in the end, you'll likely end up dead. Now, where's the link to the environment at all this? Well, let's think about government. What does the government do? Well, the government likes to spend a lot of money, and the government often, most of the time, spends outside its means. Again, we won't go into the government actually having means because it doesn't generate any money, it just takes it from other people. But the government, it is a saying that the government takes $100 and uses it to borrow another $200. And of course they want to spend all this money, but they don't want to tax people at 100%. So what do to, encourage people to vote for them? Through essentially bribes and free shit, as we've seen in the last Australian election. The Labor Party and Bill Shorten were very open in their desire and their offers to spend a lot of money in people. Down where I live, they were offering money to upgrade the hospital, money to upgrade, I believe, aged care, lots of stuff like that. Well, they get this money by taking on debt, essentially. And I've got another video coming up looking at the debt at Australia at the moment and how it's increased over time. But Australia is in over $530 billion of debt at the moment. Now this is $530 billion of future resources that has been consumed in the present. So let's think about this. Now when the government takes on money either through debt or taxation, and debt really is just deferred taxation because they need to pay that back somehow, it shuffles it around to various parts of its multi-limbed appendages. So say for example the government wants to subsidize, let's say an explicit example of a logging company. Now if the government spent within its means, it didn't take on debt, well then perhaps it wouldn't have enough money that year to pay that logging company. Well then that logging company can't go down and chop down a bunch of trees. But if they take on debt and they consume resources from the future in the present, well then they can subsidize that logging company, and that logging company can go ahead and chop down 1,000 trees, burdening Mother Nature's resources further. And there are a million and one applications of this idea. We think of the government apparatus of socialised healthcare. Well, that allows more people to consume more resources. If we build a public hospital where we couldn't do it without debt, well, then we have this huge hospital running all these lights, running all these machines, employing all these people who drive to and from work, and this all wouldn't be possible without government debt. So government debt has allowed us to place more strain on nature's resources by building this hospital. We can also think of roads. Say, for example, the government raises $100 trillion a year to spend on stuff, and it wants to build this road, but it runs out of money, so it's like, okay, we'll just grab another $50 million worth of debt and use that to pay for this road. Well, the government has then consumed $50 million of future resources in order to pave this road, which gouges out a section of the country and obviously requires massive amounts of fossil fuels to be produced, because you need all the machines, all the cars that drive people to work, and that sort of thing. This is equivalent, back to our example of buying shoes, of someone just loading up on debt and debt and debt after debt. They buy the pair of shoes, then they buy themselves a new computer, then a new car, and a fancy new set of clothes, and all they're doing is, quote, spending more of their future working hours. Now, on its own, that's not so bad. It sucks to be that person once that debt finally catches up to you, and you've got to slave forever with under interest and that sort of thing, trying to pay back for all this short-term gratification. But unfortunately, the government is consuming nature's scarce resources that we all need to survive. If the government keeps spending money from the future, and it gets to the point where we pollute the oceans and they become so acidified that they can't support sufficient fish populations, well, then we can't eat fish anymore, and that's a big problem. If the government wants to subsidize the building of houses and help people move into houses and stuff like that, well, then again, it's borrowing resources from the future in order to pay people to cut down trees and transport the wood over the world from the Amazon to Australia, for example, and build those houses, which again wouldn't be possible without this money. And then using that money and giving it to people, those people are able to buy petrol, for example, which obviously places more strain on Mother Nature. So we can understand how government debt is not good for the environment. Again, this is something that is not brought up when environmentalists are talking about the impact on the environment. Now, I don't know why it's not brought up. Maybe because they see the government as benevolent. It's the figure they run to in order to restrain corporations and pass laws and that sort of thing. So maybe they don't exactly see it as a opposing force to nature, but a very benevolent force. As we've now seen throughout this video, this is not the case. By encouraging mass immigration from the third world to the first world, and by subsequently taking on massive amounts of debt to help subsidize this, the government is aiding in the consumption of nature's future resources in the present. This is not good for the environment. Whether you believe in climate change or not, if we use up all of Earth's resources, well, then millions of people are going to die because, human populations are sustained by the consumption of resources, and if we use it all up, if we eat all our food, if we burn down all our wood to keep warm in the present, and we've got nothing to build shelters with, then we're going to be in a lot of trouble. I highly encourage each and every one of you to bring up these important topics during any discussion on environmentalism, global warming, climate change, call it whatever you want. These are things that need to be discussed, not only for the impact on the environment, but the preservation of our nations as a whole. Obviously, the debt machine is completely unsustainable in the long run. It's just not going to work. And obviously the migration is obviously completely unsustainable in another route. Obviously the cultural route, the interactions between cultures with different values, it does not work out in the long run. It's not working out what we've seen. It's not worked out in the past. And obviously this is something we want to prevent. And obviously we want to leave the earth in a pretty good state as well for our children and future generations. Leave it like we saw it. Let's do a better job than the boomers. Let's not be bribed by government spending. Let's not be bribed by the temptation of, feel-good promotion of mass migration, social justice and virtue signaling and that sort of thing. Let's take a stand for Mother Nature and let's oppose mass immigration and let's oppose government debt. Thanks all for sticking around and have a good one.